Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
My God, it's full of stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space, the sci-fi movie review podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Scott Weatherly, and I'm joined by Julian. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm good. I'm quite excited for today. We're jumping back into, I suppose, our childhood, and I'm interested to see how our views go for this, because today we're going to be reviewing The Star Wars, or Star Wars Episode 6, A New Hope. Whichever title you take, and whichever the views are. But
Well, episode 4, right?
episode 4, so off episode 6. Yes,
Yeah,
episode 4,
yeah.
of course. Episode 4.
I should not be the one correcting this as the
No.
person who is less of a Star Wars fan.
Yeah, I have to admit, the whole episode thing, it just, even as a kid, it bothered me. But yeah, we'll get on to that in a bit. But yeah, so we're going to be talking about Star Wars, the original film from 1977, directed and written by George Lucas, starring Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Alec Guinness, David Prowse, Kenny Baker, Peter Mayhew, and Anthony Daniels. And that's just a few, really. But let's start. So I'm going to just throw it out there. So your first thoughts on this classic film? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting you talk about diving back into our childhoods, because I have to admit that when I was a kid, I loved this movie. And I remember, watching it not just on VHS, but on Laserdisc. I remember, I had the toys. I had a beloved Empire Strikes Back blanket. I had all the gizmos, and I grew up with Star Wars. It's in my DNA. But I have to say, I mean, imagine we were reviewing this in 77. You're going through these actors, and I'm thinking, like, yeah, Alec Guinness is okay. I mean, this is not exactly really a great movie or great performances. Looking back on it now, I mean, I have to say, it was painful watching this. It was painful rewatching this for me. It is so slow. And what I came away with, though, was actually I liked it more this time around than in recent viewings. But what I came away with was the sense of design. Obviously, the music is great, but I love the design. The design work is fantastic. The corridors of the ship at the beginning, the Jawa cruiser's great. Luke's speeder, the bar scene, maybe hasn't aged great, but I mean, it's still cool to see all these different aliens, the computers, the Death Star. The special effects are terrible, but the model work is pretty cool to see. So I kind of immerse myself in that design, and I love the design work. I think it's just great, but boy, that plot is not good. And, there's a lot that doesn't make sense, and it is slow to me. So, I mean, I don't know. I found myself thinking, like, the two of us have talked previously about, not Buck Rogers, but what is that 1980 movie with a Queen soundtrack?
Flash Gordon.
Yeah, Flash Gordon. Thank you. And, I'm kind of Flash Gordon, because we all know that it's camp and it's bad, right? I mean, it's bad.
Yeah.
It has flying winged guys and, nothing really makes sense. And I kept thinking, like, I'm more forgiving of that than I am of Star Wars. And Star Wars is a better movie. But Star Wars is this kind of phenomenon, and it's so wired into the DNA of sci-fi and of the blockbuster, and I think its influence has been largely terrible. And I'm less forgiving of it than I am of Flash Gordon, which everybody knows is kind of, at best, camp fun.
Yeah.
So that's my initial rant, Scott.
It's funny because I've watched this a whole number of times. I've got Kicking Around in the Attic. I've still got I've got them on DVD. I've got them on Steelbook Blu-ray, and I actually have still got in the attic it's probably not the best thing, but I've got this when they released the special edition on VHS. So I've got the silver Darth Vader looking box up in the attic as well. So like you say, it's always been there, but it's one of those films I've never watched with a critical eye. Because you just sort of go, it's Star Wars. It's one of those things. It's sort of, I suppose it's a bit like, to me, it's a bit like Goonies, in that I watched it. This, Goonies, and Back to the Future, 3 films that I probably watched over and over and over again as a kid, and I've never sort of applied a critical eye to. And I do look back and go, if I was to go and watch one of those films and sort of, like you say, disconnect that nostalgia and actually watch them and actually watch them, like, would they stand up? And I'm a little bit scared to do that, to be honest. And I was nervous going into this one, thinking, right, I'm gonna discuss it and we're going to talk about it properly. And there are flaws in this film, especially, as you say, with the plotting and the pacing that were abundantly more obvious this time than they ever have been before. However, having said that, it was still like stepping into like a warm blanket. You sort of wrap yourself up and you go, oh yeah, it's brilliant. And there are things in this I love. Like, I love the world building. I love, like you say, the design, and I just love some of the characters. However, like I say, it's probably not the characters that people expect. I actually find some of the main, but we'll get into it. But I've never warmed to Luke Skywalker. Like I probably more so now he's a grumpy old man, But in the original trilogy, like, I never really warmed to Luke Skywalker, because I either find him in this to be a bit of a whiny kid, and then he becomes a bit of a sort of an arrogant dick later on.
Yeah,
and so it was interesting. So yeah, no, I love this film, and there are moments that, like, when you hear like that the 20th Century Fox fanfare, and then it's followed by the scroll and that sort of stuff, and then the music hits and all that stuff. It's like it's in my head, like, that's just a natural sequence. Like, I hear that, and it's almost, like when you've heard an album over and over again, and when what song comes next, and you're sort of like, you're one beat ahead of when that next song starts. Yeah. It's like that throughout this film. There are certain moments I'm like, oh, and that's coming next. Oh, and that's coming next.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, like, when there's sort of like the I was watching it with a friend, and there's the studio titles, and then that sting comes on as the Williams score starts, and Star Wars comes on the title. I actually paused it and said to my friend, that was the best part of this movie. Because of exactly what you're saying. Like, I feel that that first note comes on, and that aggressive, just insanely large title which is a stupid title, right? I mean, it's Star Trek, Star Wars. It's not really a war story, but man, I hear that music and I'm taken right back. And it's like, the John Williams Superman score does that to me. As soon as I hear that Superman theme, I'm a kid again. So I definitely identify with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think, like I say, the music is, John Williams, let's just be fair, like, John Williams is the 3 most iconic. And when you're a kid, like, you don't think in terms of, like, who's done it. But for me, like you say, the main Star Wars theme, the 70s, the sort of 70s Superman the movie, Superman theme, and Indiana Jones march, like, those 3 anthems, like, they are anthems to me. They're amazing. So John Williams is sort of is an icon, and it's just the moment that hits, I to fight that nostalgia is really hard.
Well, I kept
Um,
thinking watching this. I'm tempted to say this movie would be better with the sound off, except for the John Williams score. If you could do this almost as a silent, but there are long silent sequences anyway, which I actually kind of like. That's the case. But I mean, much of the dialogue is just not good. I mean, the acting is okay. The dialogue is painful in a lot of places. But that Williams score, I mean, if you could imagine this movie without that Williams score, you'd kind of say like, oh, well, this is not that great of a movie. The great design work, but like that's true of many, many movies, that the score really tells you what to feel and brings you into the action. And when you see many movies without the score, they just don't work. But I think that's especially true here. But I do want to say, like, this thing about like being critical, right? Being critical of our darlings. I think, look, I mean, I have kind of grown out of Star Wars to a large extent. But I was a kid. I mean, I went to see the world premiere of Return of the Jedi because my dad worked at the American Film Institute. And I was like, I mean, I just thought that was the best movie ever. I loved it. So, I mean, this stuff is in my DNA, but I really think that there's not a space in our culture to be able to say, I like this Marvel movie, or I like this Star Wars movie, or I like, Star Trek, or whatever, but I am not pretending that it's great. I happen to really enjoy a lot about the Michael Bay Transformers movies. They are not good movies, by and large. There's some things I would defend, but I mean, I am aware they are horrible movies and have racial issues, gender issues, all of it. But I kind of love baby Dinobots, and I know that is stupid. I know there's no reason for them to even exist, but I just see those baby Dinobots and I'm filled with joy. And I mean, I think that it should be totally acceptable to say, this movie has problems. There's some stuff that I defend, but, I'm not pretending that it's a masterpiece, but it makes me happy. And actually talking about the ways in which it makes me happy does kind of get at what's working in the film or not working.
No, I do agree with that. Like you say, you're right. You should be able to sort of hold it up to that critical eye, and still say, actually, but I still enjoy it. And I think that's where we're going to get to with me on this film. Because again, watching it again, like I said, I never warmed to Mark Hamill's Luke Skywalker, and watching it, I've always felt like Alec Guinness is half in this film and half out, in the sense of like, and there's obviously all the anecdotes and the stories of like he really didn't want to do this, and I think there are scenes where it's abundantly clear. And he's having, especially the scene when he's spouting on the Millennium Falcon. He's with Han, and he's Luke is doing the lightsaber thing with the little floating droid, that's shooting the little mini lasers, and he has to start saying, feel the Force, and he puts the helmet on. So you can almost see he's like, what am I saying? Like, what is this garbage? And you can tell he's sort of like, he's just thinking, I'm getting paid for this. I can retire. I'll be fine. But the one thing is, though, like you say, when I was a kid, and even now, like, I love the imagination of this film. The problem I sort of have with it is, to me, and I don't know if this is just sort of the way I am, is it never felt like a complete story. And so the fact that it had like that scroll at the beginning, everyone goes on about it. So it just drops you in the story, and you straight off to it, and you get the sort of the crews are coming over the top at the beginning. I was like, yeah, it looks great, but it's not a complete story. Like I do feel like you're stepping into like halfway into a story. And even if I do that with comics, like if you start a run and you're coming in like issue 4, then I'm going to go, well, I want issues 1, 2, and 3, please, because I want to see how they started. And I know it's supposed to be Luke's story, and you do get the information as you go, but it almost feels like you're being cheated on purpose. And I know sort of they said, oh, we wanted to do that because it felt like it was a pulp serial and, all that sort of thing. But it almost feels like that they're retconning things because they didn't do so, or because of this. Someone points something out, they go, "Oh, that's because of this," and it always felt like they were retconning themselves to try and justify some of the decisions they made.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I was particularly excited when they were going to go back and do the prequels. And one day we may talk about those because of the level of disappointment I felt with some of that. Again, I will say though, although I was disappointed with some of the prequels, they're not as terrible as I think people say they are. But yeah, with this, I think some of it's abundantly clear as you get older. You sort of okay, that's fine. But then there's others like I love Peter Cushing in this film.
Yeah.
Like I think I love Peter Cushing anyway. I think he's a fantastic actor. I'm a big fan of all his Hammer work and other stuff, but his Amicus work in particular. But he's just he's so deliciously evil in this film, and I love him for it because he's sort of like he's obviously done all these horror films in the past. So for him, this is his bread and butter. This playing this character, and he's brilliant. Like so cold, and I'm sort of he's not in the film enough for my liking, but. Yeah, that's the sort of the characters I like in this. There's lots of like little peripheral characters. I'm like, they're brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, this thing about like starting in medias res, I mean that I guess that doesn't bother me. I do think that it's hard to watch this. For me, it's hard to watch this critically because I keep thinking of the sequels and the prequels, and I hear, I mean, it's like going back and reading, John from the Bible, like you've grown up with, all of these people telling you what this means. It's really hard to go back and read it with new eyes and be like, oh, wait a minute, that's kind of contradictory there. That's not done well. Because you have the retcons in your head, the explanations. So, I mean, I found myself, saying like, well, when Leia's talking about, my dad says this, and I'm thinking like, oh yeah, she clearly in this movie, that's her dad, right?
Yes.
And and it's a retcon that it's the guy and
adopted,
right, and and he's inserted into I mean, I think he's briefly in the special edition of Return of the Jedi. Return of the Jedi. But so I mean, I kind of catch myself saying this stuff, like, the stuff about Uncle Ben. It's like, not Uncle Ben, but Uncle Owen, like, how did you get with them again? And by the way, Luke is a total dick to them. I mean, Uncle Owen isn't the best guy ever, but it's like, I guess they're dead. He mourns more for Ben Kenobi, who absolutely commits suicide, I mean, I'm getting off topic, but the whole Ben Kenobi death is like, I'm fighting with Darth. What does it mean you're going to be stronger when you're struck down? If that's true, why didn't you just stab yourself with a lightsaber and get it over with? And then he sees Luke walk into the room and he's like, hey, Luke, now that you're here, I really want you to watch this. And like locks eyes with Luke and just like lets himself die. It's so absurdly done. But that
just to really convey that trauma. I'm really gonna hammer this trauma.
Yeah,
home.
hey Luke, watch this. Like now that you're here, I can die. It's so bizarre. But that thing about that conversation while Luke's training on the Millennium Falcon is key to me. And not only is you're right that Guinness doesn't seem into it, but I also think that dialogue is part of, one of the deeper problems that I have with the story, which is that, Luke isn't just whiny. First of all, you're supposed to kind of identify with the talented kid who from the country who goes to the big city, right? I mean, that's the story. That's supposed to be a kind of everyman story and an American story, of going out and succeeding by your own wits. Except really he is part of an inherited caste of privileged people. His father was a Jedi and, he's got Ben Kenobi watching over him. And especially as, we get into the sequels, you know, he really is not the everyman that this movie wants him to be. He's a privileged shit, and he has more in common with Donald Trump than he does with you. You know, he is part of an inherited, caste system in which only certain people can use the Force, right? That talk about like, oh, the hypnosis scene irritates the hell out of me. Like, oh, they're weak-minded. Yeah, screw those stormtroopers, right? We have inherited our special ability. That let's not mourn for Uncle Owen because he's just part of hoi polloi. He doesn't matter. He's just a stupid farmer. You have inherited this special ability and this relationship to the Force. You are the lords of this feudal society, and we're better, and that's why we rise to the top. The way he talks down to those fighter pilots, like, well, I used to bullseye womp rats. Oh, go screw yourself, Luke. It's so, and what I really hate about this is what Guinness says there is like, your eyes can deceive you. Trust your feelings, your instinct. When Luke says that to those pilots, those are trained pilots. They've put in more hours than him. There's a kind of like deep anti-intellectualism in this film. Training doesn't matter. Building the Death Star, those engineers are just stupid. All you really need is to believe in yourself.
I agree. It is. It's very sort of I do see what you're saying. That it is that sort of thing, isn't it? It's true. Actually, what you say is it's all about sort of like the that special savior again, isn't it? Sort of like you've got the special power, like you are the chosen one. I mean, it's the same thing, I suppose, for the Matrix and that sort of thing, isn't it? It's sort of Luke is that chosen one. Like he can't lose, and I suppose you could take it the other way, that idea it's supposed to be. I can see you saying about the anti-intellectualism, but there's also the notion of saying that you can do anything you want, and it's heavy-handed and it's not particularly conveyed well. But if you believe in yourself, then you can achieve anything you want. It's Luke is he's working on a moisture farm at the beginning of the film, and by the end of it, he becomes the hero of the Resistance. And he learns. Not only does he learn to trust his feelings and all this other stuff, and he's not conveyed well, and partly I blame Hamill's acting ability, but he also learns learns teamwork, but he starts to sort of demonstrate it more than just being selfish. He sort of learns from Alec Guinness, and then he sort of has to sort of cope with Han and work with Leia, and it sort of forms that bond by the end of the film. So it's a growth story. He doesn't grow much, but I still see it as a growth. So I can see what you're saying, because again, if I was one of those pilots that sort of like, I've been fighting this resistance for years, and then this kid comes along and is like, well, I can do it because I used to do this at home in the swamps, and you just be like, oh, like you say, screw you, like, all right, fine, do it, kid, but again, I think this comes down to the fact that, like you say, there's the story this film wants to tell and wants to convey, and then there's the story that George Lucas wrote. And I think what was in George Lucas's head and what sort of ends up on the paper and on the screen are slightly askew in that way. And I do think it's because it has to land at his feet. It has to land at George Lucas's feet, that he didn't know how to direct some of this cast to get what he wanted for this story.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And as you say, I mean, every story about a kind of messiah figure is also a sort of like believe in yourself story, right? I mean, it's impossible not to watch The Matrix and think, I identify with Neo and I could be that. And that doesn't really bear intellectual scrutiny, but you do feel kind of charged up and empowered by it. But then the two of us are white guys, right? So it's easier to say that. I mean, I do think there's that issue too. But yeah, I agree with you about, I mean, ultimately, like the whole believe in yourself thing is also about Lucas and where Lucas was when he was making this. Nobody believed in him. When he was directing this, the cast and crew literally laughed at him as he was directing it. And Guinness, even though Guinness, wrote these famous letters about every rewrite is worse than the last and how terrible this movie was, he actually was, because he was such a professional actor, he actually helped get the cast and crew to follow Lucas, because he said, look, this is the director. I'm a pro. This is what you do. Shut up. It's Lucas's vision. Follow it. So, I mean, I think ultimately, Lucas had that vision. He followed it through. He's not in control of it. It's not a movie that's in control of what it's saying or what its messages are. And that's part of its charm too, is that it's a bunch of ideas. It's a bunch of designs thrown together. Nothing really makes sense. It's not a coherent world, but it is a fantastically designed world with lots of cool stuff in it. And especially as a kid, that's what you want, right?
Well, totally. And we'll get on to something you just triggered in my head in a minute. But one of the things I feel with this film, that again, is Lucas retcon. And let's be honest, like, Lucas will go back and tinker with anything, whenever he gets the chance. And one day we will talk about THX and all that kind of stuff, and his first film, and see how that sort of stands up to this as well. But with Lucas, he always said about how he had all these sort of like all these other stories and this vision of a saga and all this other stuff in his head from the moment he started this. And again, like, the number of times I've watched this and thought, no, you didn't, because this is clearly, as you say, a hodgepodge of ideas that you thought were cool. And that isn't a bad thing, because I actually think that, the notion of Jedi is quite cool. It's this thing of like the sort of, they're almost like the warrior monks, and you go, okay, well, so it's a little bit of like Shaolin, it's a little bit of Japanese samurai culture, it's a little bit of this, it's a little bit of that, and he's taken them all and he's thrown them all in. And for one film, for me, it works quite well. You've got this notion of like you say, this warrior, sort of like almost like a peaceful but warrior cast of Jedis that have sort of special powers, or have access to the Force. And like I say, as a sort of as a surface thing, it works quite well. But it shows it wasn't fully thought out, because the amount of retcons and stuff they've had to do to sort of shoehorn in other ideas. Like, maybe one day we'll talk about metachlorines, and it shows that sort of like, so I don't believe this was as thought out as he has claimed since. I do agree that I think this is almost on the hoof. He was doing it as he was going.
Yeah, I mean,
and it does give it a charm, though.
No, I agree, and I think there's nothing wrong with making a narrative out of like a list of cool ideas that you want to shoehorn in. There are great stories that have been made that way, but you hope that there is that other part of your brain as a creator that edits that, right? And that sort of brings it all into coherence with each other. And I think that, Lucas kind of falls down on that point. And I don't doubt that he had a saga in his head. But when you look at what he said about that saga, like he did not know Darth Vader was Luke and Leia's father. I mean, that's absolutely shown. No. I think it's kind of the thing where like he's making this movie and he's like, well, I could tell a story about that Senate, that's being referenced a couple times. I mean, we have the Senate disbanded and you don't even show anything, right? There is this reference to the Emperor. Clearly in this movie, he doesn't think the Emperor is going to be important or the Senate is really important. It's like, those are stories I could do at another time. But it's not important to the story. So, I mean, I think that he might have had a saga in his head, but it was very inchoate and it kept changing the same way this movie kept changing. And when he actually sits down to flesh stuff out, ideas morph very rapidly in his head and he introduces new ideas and it all just sort of changes. If that makes sense. That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's like you say, the story that he was, the story he wants to tell, the message he wants to convey, like you say, starts to get as I said, the story he was putting down isn't the one that ends up on screen, and that may be that he started a scene or he started a story plot, and he's excised an idea or he's added in an idea, and it's like you say, it's evolved, and so like you say, it does feel at times like there's not so much drop storylines, but there's sort of, there's drop comments about the wider world. But then again, I to flip it over as well, I agree in that sense of, you and I will do things, have conversations, or you might have a day or a week, whatever, and you might reference something in the wider world, but that doesn't mean you're going to provide full explanation about it.
Sure.
Otherwise it just becomes weirdly human exposition through your day. So I get that when they do reference things like, the whether it be the Senate or the Empire or the Emperor and all this other stuff, like you get, oh, okay, there is a wider world, but they don't need to explain it at this point. So I'm quite comfortable with some of that, but then there's others that you sort of go, that sort of needs explanation at this point. And I sort of feel that a little bit with the Jedi, when sort of like, Alec Guinness is like, oh, it's a dead order and it can do this. I'm like, so, all right, well, I still want more information about what it is. Like, I always felt that, and you get it. And again, like you say, it's hard to sort of disconnect this from my wider knowledge of the Star Wars universe, because I know what the Jedi Order is, I know how it works and all this other stuff. But watching this film, there are moments I'm like, the explanations just feel a bit, you're trying to train this kid, like give him something more. Like I'm sat there with like, if he's the point of view character, like, he needs more, exposition. And I do feel like it wasn't there. Like Lucas couldn't give it at that point, which is fine. It's a kid's film. It doesn't need it. Coming out as an adult, I'm like, okay, I want a little bit more. But
yeah, I mean,
still, the moment he's got a lightsaber, I'm pretty happy with that.
Right, and look, that's the epitome of what this movie is, right? I mean, the lightsaber doesn't make sense, right? I mean, it's a sword made of light that cuts things somehow, and the beam of light stops. I mean, but it doesn't make sense. It's cool, right? If it's cool, put it in is the rule. Don't think too much about it, and that's fine. I mean, it has its place. I know what you're saying about the Jedi, and it's really hard watching this, especially knowing what you know about the other films and, the expanded universe and everything. The way they talk about it as a dead order, this ancient religion, it really seems in this movie as if it's trying to do this sort of fantasy thing in which, like, there was this better, more noble time, and it has fallen, and now then evil has taken over the land. And that's kind of loosely grafted onto the sort of Roman idea of, falling from a republic into empire. Really it's sort of swords and sorcery in space. It has structurally, and in its worldview, it has a lot more to do with Conan than it does anything recognizably sci-fi, which is also one of my gripes against it, is that it's, taken on its own, this movie is fine. I actually prefer both of the sequels to this, parts 5 and 6 to this one. I think they're structured better. But taken on its own is okay, but the influence of that, of like, how, I always think, like, how far away is any planet from any other planet? Like, none of it makes any sense. It's just like, let's get in our craft and, we'll punch the button and then we'll be at Alderaan, there's this, the whole lunacy of this escape pod. Like, you've got someone in your cargo bay and it's like, there are prisoners, but somehow they launched an escape pod from the ship that goes through the cargo bay doors. Really? And then they're like, oh, let's not fire on that because there's no life signs. That robots exist, right? They're everywhere. You're aware of this fact. I mean, none of this makes any sense. But then that escape pod lands on Tatooine. And presumably that's because Leia knows somehow about Ben Kenobi and, wants to send them to Ben. I'm not sure how she knows that. I'm sure there's some retcon explaining that, but Tatooine must be really close to that Star Cruiser.
Well, yeah, that's something that again I have in more recent years scratched my head about, and it was actually since Rogue One. Rogue One made me ask this question of Star Wars that I'd never asked before. Because again, I'd sort of just I'd pretty much always accepted it, but this notion. So in Rogue One, the recent one, you understand how the plans for the Death Star were acquired. And so the ship, they're acquired, and they sort of liaise with Leia on the ship that you then see at the start of this film, and then they're being pursued by Darth Vader. Fine, all good. I kind of like Rogue One. I think it's a good film, but with this, like they get on Leia's ship and she escapes and all this other stuff, and she's being pursued by the cruiser. Is it just coincidence then that in a galaxy that is billions of light years across? Because she didn't know she was going to have to dispose of them. Like, as far as she was concerned, she thought she was onto a winner. Like they were going to deliver the Death Star plans, and she was off to join the rest of the Resistance to understand what this Death Star is. So is it just coincidence that, or was she aiming for, like you say, for Tatooine, that she ends up getting them to Ben Kenobi? Does she know he's there? And if she knows he's there, like what does she know of him as who he is? And it just everything starts. The coincidences started to pile up a little bit, because then I'm like, so okay, so he was always been on Tatooine. So he's what? So then going back to the prequels, I'm like, okay, so he was obviously Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he actually helped Leia and Luke. He separated them and he handled them. So he's been on Tatooine all these years with Luke, and so that's a coincidence. And I don't know. And it just so happens that Luke then buys the droids with with the message in, and again it's sort of like, okay, the coincidences start to pile up, and you've just almost got to roll on with it, So okay, I've got to accept that the first 20 minutes of this film is just a series of coincidences.
That's very true, and I'm glad you mentioned Rogue One, because I think Rogue One may well be the best of all of the Star Wars films. Honestly, there's not a lot of competition, but for an actual good Star Wars movie, right? But Rogue One is a solid movie, and yeah, it's sort of, it's amazing how well it syncs with this. And people complain about, like, oh, well, that means, she's lying, Leia's lying about, oh, we're just wandering around here, when Vader confronts her. But that's not a problem for me. And it seems to me that all of, like, if you watched Rogue One, and then this, right? You watched all, 8 movies, the 9th is coming out. But if you watched all of those, maybe Solo, but certainly Rogue One is such a good movie and makes sense and has more of a sense of the war of Star Wars. And then if you followed it with this, the difference in quality between those two is phenomenal. It really is like, oh, here's an actual good movie. Rogue One has its problems, for sure. It's not a perfect movie, but it's such a masterful film compared to this. And again, this is old, right? Give it props.
Yeah. I was going to say there are two. Like I say, so because you are right, and Rogue One does introduce a series of problems for this film, and the first one for me is that series of coincidences. Like, again, it just sets up that thing, and I struggle to get past that a little bit at times, but I can accept it. But the other one is Darth Vader. So in this film, Darth Vader he's cool. They've set him up to be this sort of monolithic kind of sort of like silhouette. Do you know what I mean? So they hired David Prowse because he was a bodybuilder. He was a big guy. He's sort of like 6'3", 6'4". He's wearing platform shoes in this anyway. So I think he's like 6'5" in the full suit. And they keep his movements minimal. So there's a lot of like stillness in this film. Like, he stands there and is just imposing, and then just walks out, or it's just one arm being used to raise someone or to sort of do the force choke and all that kind of stuff. Like, he is a very still. Darth Vader's a very still figure. He's just there to be like an imposing menace, in the background a lot of times, all sort of stuff. Then you go to Rogue One, and at the end of Rogue One, when he finally pairs up, like he's an athlete. Like he's lifting people up with the Force, he's throwing them around, he's twirling lightsabers, he's he's like kicking ass. And like literally within 20 minutes, like he must have pulled a muscle or something. Because by the time he gets to Star Wars, like he's just walking in. He's like, I'm knackered. I've just taken out a load of those rebels. I'm knackered, so I'll leave the troops to do it. It does feel a little bit incongruous at times.
That's fair.
But it also does it does go to show, like you say, the difference in period. But I would also say that I think that whilst I've really enjoyed Rogue One, and I do think that Vader's appearance in Rogue One is brilliant, but it's a different Vader, as in like that's set up to be a badass. Like he's supposed to be a warrior, but I do kind of like him as this just sort of like menacing, monolithic presence in this film. I just find it sometimes a bit more intimidating.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, I think that sequence at the end of Rogue One works on its own terms. It works for Rogue One, but you're absolutely right. And personally, I don't need the badass Vader, but I don't mind it. But you're right, it's incongruous. There's even a sequence early on in this film, in A New Hope, where Vader's sort of like coming down a corridor early on in Leia's captured ship that is oddly reminiscent of, if you watch them in order, a scene you have just seen, in which he is throwing people around with the Force and yada yada yada. And the tone is utterly different, right? I mean, it's just guys on a soundstage and some stormtroopers with blasters. So you're right, but I also think most of these, I mean, might be a case where I prefer the A New Hope version of Vader. Having said that, like those coincidences are there in the film already. Those are problems with A New Hope that already existed. And I think going from the more careful structure and plotting and art of Rogue One to A New Hope underlines how shoddy the plot of A New Hope really is.
Is it? I mean, I've just literally just been a look at sort of the other two, and I think it's funny that they always say that there are certain people that need an editor. They need like another voice to sort of say to them, no, that, go with that, try to pull back on this and that sort of thing. I mean, this was written and directed by George Lucas, so it's his vision for good or ill, it's his vision. But then, like I say, when you look at the follow-ups, so the Empire Strikes Back, you've actually got Irvin Kershner now doing the direction. You've got additional people coming in to polish up the script, and then obviously that's then followed up with Return of the Jedi, and you've got Richard Marquand doing the direction, and you've got again Lawrence Kasdan and others coming in to do and polish up the script. And so you've got those other voices that are coming in and saying to George Lucas, let's really push on that. So and hold back on that, and we'll do this and we'll do that. And I've never been deep enough in the sort of like the behind the scenes lore to know what is fully George Lucas and what would have been those other people's voices. But I do see that there's clearly another hand in that. And obviously there's others like Kathleen Kennedy and others as well that have been involved since, that have then had that influence and sort of probably tailored what it is. They've come in and he's gone, I want to do all these things. And they've gone, that's brilliant, George. We can do that and that. Maybe not so much that and that sort of thing. And they've had to compromise. I mean, do you think that sort of has tailored the vision since?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny that to look at the evolution of sort of the cult of Lucas among Star Wars fans, because sort of before the prequels came out, I think that was the dominant view, was that among Star Wars fans was that, this is so Lucas's vision. he controlled everything. Yeah, there were these other people who, were script doctors or directed it for him, but but he did have full control to a great degree. But then the prequels came out, and look, the studios were still able to dictate stuff to Lucas. Not really true when it came to the prequels. And I think the prequels sort of showed, okay, well, when Lucas runs his own show and has the kind of clout where a studio can't tell him what to do. I mean, he essentially made those movies, the prequels, himself, and got a distributor. That was not the way those first 3 films were made.
No.
They were made much in the studio system. And, although he got favorable terms, right? But so those prequels sort of proved, okay, well, Lucas is fallible, right? Even to Star Wars fans, they had to admit, okay, Lucas run crazy is fallible. And I think that, while there are problems with what Disney has done, and there's, big debate about this, and it's all political and everything, I think it's inarguable that the average Disney Star Wars film, while I've got problems with them, is better than the average pre-Disney Star Wars film. Those prequels are, they're not as bad as everyone says. They're ambitious. Some of it is very groan-worthy, but they're not great movies. I mean, A New Hope is not great. I mean, it's dazzling and charming, but it's not, if it were released today, it would not have this kind of influence. So, I mean, I think that
I agree.
Even going back to the first one, Lucas was edited and Lucas was censored. There's this famous story about the early cuts of Star Wars. And Star Wars was supposed to premiere in December of 1976 and was not ready. And the early cuts of Star Wars, when he screened it for Spielberg and a bunch of other sort of like, the new voices in Hollywood. And everybody laughed at it. And back then it was using World War II footage, footage from other movies to simulate these TIE fighter battles and everything. And, apparently it had like 40 more minutes on Tatooine that was basically like just Luke hanging out, and it was like American Graffiti in space, where it was just like Luke is this disaffected sort of young adult hanging out with his friend, and are you going to go to the academy or not? And there was much more of that stuff. And really the film was changed a lot in editing, not just with the additional special effects, but really minimizing that whole Tatooine stuff and maximizing sort of the space opera stuff. So the other thing is, I mean, Lucas was talked out of a lot of stuff. There are reports that, and I do think that the droids kind of steer the show. I mean, R2-D2 and C-3PO are, for me, the most interesting characters, and their bumbling misadventures, where the movie, sort of the first half of the movie really is that. It's quite charming and works well for me. But there are reports that originally, like, I think C-3PO was going to speak in a foreign accent and be a kind of racial stereotype that we associate with like Jar Jar Binks and characters in the prequels. All of those errors in the prequels were things that he wanted to do in the original trilogy and was talked out of. So, he was edited even on this.
Yeah, it goes to show that, like you say, he's an ideas man. Like he is, he's clearly got an imagination. He's clearly, an ideas person. He's got those sort of things, but he obviously you've said like he had at least some sort of editing going on at this point. And I think, like you say, there are certain things that get through that have gotten through that you do think, okay, that's pure Lucas. Then that's that level of imagination. But it makes me wonder then what would have happened if it had been given more sway. Like, would this have been the juggernaut, the pop culture icon that it is today if he'd have had his full sway. Would George Lucas have walked away with $4 billion from Disney if he'd have had his own say on this first film? Yeah, that's really interesting. I do find that notion interesting. You sort of see it on in other things. There's other partnerships that you see that sort of they temper each other, and then when you see them apart, you realise that they were better together. I was massive into wrestling, like WWF and WWE in the sort of the 90s and the early 2000s. And there was this big thing about sort of like, Vince McMahon, he's the big head of it. And then Vince Russo was the sort of the writer, and everyone was sort of, they're at each other's throats. And then what you realize was actually that conflict between them actually created some of the best, well, for me at least, the most entertaining wrestling TV ever. And then when they were separated, like Vince Russo went off and did something in WCW, and he literally killed the wrestling promotion, and Vince, became incredibly bland at times. And it goes to show that sometimes I'm convinced that you need that other personality to act as an editor or sort of as an instigator or whatever. But yeah, it's just interesting for me that, like I say, this isn't George's perfect vision, and that's probably for the best by the sound of it.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I do think that, look, he's a great ideas guy. I do think that it's important to temper some of these visions, and some of the people who I most admire as directors and as writers. I mean, I think of writers who they get their first couple novels out and they're brilliant, but then they just have too much clout. And they don't really have to edit themselves, and they don't spend, 3 years editing the novel anymore. They just, it's like, well, that's good enough because that's Mr. So-and-so. And then the quality starts dropping. Yeah, I mean, I love this question of sort of like, if you had some of these changes in Star Wars, if we knew it closer to the original vision in certain respects, I can't imagine it would have been quite the hit that it was. And it's so funny to imagine. I mean, basically, like, I think anything you do, having badmouthed this film, and there's so much I could say, whether it's, I love the torture droid, but nobody mentions Leia's been tortured. Nobody cares about Alderaan, how do, they're just like, police do a more competent search than these stormtroopers do of the Millennium Falcon. Why do you have a monster in your trash compactor? I mean, all of this is, why do you have giant chasms that you have to swing across? I mean, there's so much stuff that doesn't make sense and is dumb. But it's still fun and imaginative, and who cares? But I mean, it seems to me that you take any change you make to Star Wars, has ripple effects in pop culture that are almost unfathomable. I imagining a scenario in which C-3PO is an Asian stereotype or something. I can't imagine what the pop culture landscape looks like 30 years, 40 years out. It's really, and I think most of that influence has been bad. It's one of the things that most upsets me and disturbs me about Star Wars, is that I do think that it occupies this kind of primal real estate in the history of pop culture, and certainly and also the history of sci-fi, which, look, both of us adore. That's why we're doing this. And I don't know that influence has been good. It is amazing how much sci-fi we got because this was a success. Studios, look, Battlestar Galactica was invented to capitalize on this. I mean, we got the Star Trek movies instead of Phase 2 because of this. Superman the movie was influenced by the success of this. So, I mean, it's amazing the ripple effects of this film. And some of those were positive, at least initially, as stuff got greenlit and money got thrown at it. And whole franchises were created in its wake. and that's positive. But, it also inaugurated the whole idea of dumb blockbusters.
Yes.
It was pushed to the summer because the film was in a shitty state. The summer was not where you made your money back then. Movies coming out in December for the Christmas season, when, the kids are off school, that was when you made your most money. Summers weren't the time for blockbusters. And, this really helped inaugurate that. And I guess we're living in an era in which I feel inundated by crappy CGI blockbusters with shitty plots and little attention to character development. And every time I see that stuff, there's just this little part of my brain that says, damn Star Wars.
No, do you know what? It's funny you say that, because I was for the sister podcast, or the podcast I do, 20th Century Geek, we literally were talking about the Terminator franchise, and it seemed to be the same issue that we said, like, I'm a massive fan of Terminator 1 and 2. Like, I love those films. And again, they've got their flaws, but I think Jim Cameron is another visionary that tempers himself, or at least did. We'll see how Avatar goes, but there's this thing of, like, when you take that away and you look at the others, whether it be 3, 4, so it'd be like, Terminator 3, Salvation, and Genesis. Like, there's this notion of it's just bigger. What can we blow up? What kind of new Terminator can we make? Okay, now we're going to have 4 timelines, and we're going to have this, and we're going to have that. And at the center of it, you're like, yeah, but the characters suck, and I don't care. And that seems to be a real problem. And then you go back to the originals, and you go, actually, the first one was a really small film. It was, it was filmed sort of guerrilla style for a lot of the chase scenes and other stuff, and the cast is tight, and they worked well, and they've used well, and I love that film because it's so tight and this other stuff. Like, it knows the message it's going to say. And the same for 2. Like, 2's a really good story. Like, you are, the fact of the matter is, like, yes, it's got some amazing action scenes, but the fact of the matter is that story is about, the story is the arc of, like, Sarah Connor and all this other stuff, and I care about the people. And as we've said in this, for Star Wars, like, I didn't warm to Luke Skywalker. Like, I never have. Like, people go on about him being their sort of their go-to. Even like Han Solo. Like, yeah, I'm a little bit more interested in Han Solo. But again, like, he's never as interesting as I think people think he is. And so, like you say, these films themselves sort of suffer from that, where they get okay, well, we blew up a Death Star in the first one. What are we going to blow up in the second one? A bigger Death Star. And you go, okay, fine. Okay, so that's the progress for the next 2 films. And the second one's got a darker element to it, and that sort of thing. And then it's lightened again because you've got the Ewoks, and it's like you say, there's never, it's, I'm trying to think of the best way of putting it. It's an epic. Okay. This is an epic because it's about the Resistance versus the Empire. And I understand that there's, like, really big stakes and all this other stuff. But at no point do I ever really feel that there's a story arc. Like, do people actually, really grow? Yeah, all right, Han Solo comes back at the end of the film to save the day. And, it's a great scene and all this other stuff. But I never really fully understand why. As an adult, I love it. I think it's fantastic. The moment you see the Falcon fly in and sort of all that stuff, it's amazing. It can be a little bit fist pumping even now, but I'm never fully convinced of Solo's motivations. I'm pretty sure he sold that medal after the ceremony at the end.
Yeah, I incidentally, I hate the medal ceremony. I think it's like the weakest ending of any movie ever. But yeah, I mean, you're right. And we're left to kind of guess. Like, I always guessed, yeah, I kind of like these guys, and I'm really hot for Leia. So, and Chewie wants me to stay, but we're left to kind of guess, right?
Yeah, and that's it. And there's a lot of that, of like, oh, it's just the right thing. They're the Resistance, so of course it's the right thing, because they've shown us that the Empire is evil. They've literally destroyed a planet, and you're sort of thinking, okay, so why isn't the Resistance more powerful? Like, who else in the galaxy is not going, they just destroyed a planet. Should we not do something about it? Should we not be raising that as a bit of an issue? It just seems like you say, it's forgotten as a sort of an off-hand comment.
Well, I mean, nothing really makes sense. I mean, what is the academy that Luke's going to go to, that Luke wants to go to? What is that? I mean, he clearly hates the Empire and is fascinated by the Resistance, but obviously that academy is part of the Empire, right? I mean, it's part of the
I've always
bureaucratic state.
Yeah, I've always assumed that was the case. Now, apparently, there was supposed to be a scene, and I think this goes back to, I don't know if it exists or it was never filmed, but I've been told that the person he meets at the end. What's his name? What's his friend's name? I can't go for the life of me.
Is that Wedge?
Yes, Antilles. That's it.
Yeah.
So he sees him at the end, and he sort of he sort of vouches for Luke, doesn't he? He says, "Oh, he's the best pilot," and all this other stuff. Apparently, there's a scene that's supposed to happen before he meets Obi-Wan, in which he sort of comes to him and he says, "Oh, you're at the academy," and Wedge is supposed to say, "Actually, no, I've left the academy. I've joined the Resistance."
Right.
And that's sort of supposed to be almost like the instigator of like, no, you want to be on this side, because when you look at the plane that sort of weirdly, like, when Luke is giving C-3PO an oil bath and fixing that, he's playing with a toy with a toy, which I'm assuming must have been a prop for later in the film. I don't know, but it's a Y-wing, which is an Imperial transport. So I'm like, okay, so he is. Although he talks about the Resistance and stuff, like, he clearly has plans of joining the Imperial fleet. Like, that must be his plan.
Yeah, and I think the original script, and that early cut, his relationship to Wedge and Wedge going off and joining the academy, and then that scene you referenced of him sort of saying, "Well, actually, I'm in the Resistance." That was a huge part of that original 45 minutes or so. Which, I can't imagine how boring that would have been and how much that would have lessened the idea of Luke as the individual, right, who's making these choices. If it's like, hey, my buddy did all of this stuff first, and, I guess I'm left here on the farm. Guess I'll join him.
Yeah, and that's it. Like I say, it would have completely lessened it. It would have just been, why is Luke special? It just so happens to be that he's able to use the Force. But I'm curious as sort of the other thing as well. Again, it's not something that's sort of ever going to be covered and ever questioned. Is it's clear that people are Force sensitive. There are people out there, and Luke clearly is. Like, he's had all these other things where he says, "Oh, I've been able to shoot womp rats for years, bullseye them," which is clearly him tapping into the Force in some sort of way. So there are clearly other Force sensitive people out there. Statistically, there will be people in the Imperial fleet that are Force sensitive, and there will be people in the Resistance that are, to a degree, Force sensitive. So why not them?
Yeah.
Why is no one else gone? Do you know what? Sort of like, that pilot is a really naturally good shot. Like, we really should be putting him at the front of Blue Squadron or Black Squadron, whatever. Like, it just so happens that it feels like Luke is, he is Neo, he is the chosen one. Like, there couldn't be nobody else. But even later on, like, they say, "Oh, well, yeah, no, Leia is your sister, and oh, she's Force sensitive as well," and you sort of go, so there must be more. Like, where are they?
Yeah,
and it's just one of those things I've just sort of ignored and sort of, okay.
I mean,
it's Luke's story.
I don't know that the Force makes any sense, really. I mean, it's kind of spiritual mumbo jumbo, right? I mean, there's this life essence that is in everything, and we tap into it to hypnotize people, to acquire skills of telekinesis, to become really good shots. I mean, it's basically like, this is what grants us our mutant superhero powers. Okay, is this supposed to be like, I know this was a long time ago in a galaxy far away, but is this something that pervades the whole universe and is around now? Like, are animals possessed of, like, they have an aura that is their life force, and somehow if they tapped into it, they could perform telekinesis? I mean, this isn't really something that's thought out. And as you say, I mean, I like the idea that some people, I mean, if you have to have a force, that some people just are more sensitive to it. But as you say, I mean, it really isn't that. Luke is the chosen one. And then later on, it's established, really, this is a lineage. The whole idea of, knights, this is really a feudal, terrible society. And in the prequels, by the way, the Jedis are the bad guys. They are just horrible people and the Jedi Order is evil and must be destroyed at all costs. If you really lived in that universe, you certainly would say that. Does any of this really make sense? I mean, I get what you're saying, but it's, to me, the Force is a sort of Deus ex machina that just explains whatever you want it to explain, and we're just going to forget that we can hypnotize anyone. Literally in the next scene, in which let's get in a bar fight.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point, actually, yeah, because instead of chopping his arm off, he could have literally just said, like, this is not the young man you were looking for, or, like, you were calm down, go away. It would have been...
Well, and then he's negotiating with Han Solo. I mean, I guess you can say Han Solo is strong-willed, and the stormtroopers aren't, which is, there's that throwaway line there. But does that mean that all the stormtroopers, in addition to being faceless, there's that line about how, we know that it was stormtroopers, not Jawas, because Jawas aren't this good shots. And I think, come on, man. The rest of this entire movie, the stormtroopers are going to make animated Cobra from G.I. Joe look like crack squadrons, I mean...
You make a really good point about Han Solo. Like, it would, if anything, it would have made the character of Han Solo even more interesting, is if, like, Obi-Wan had tried to use, like, the Force suggestion on him and be like, you were going to take us to Alderaan, sort of thing. If he'd have done that and Han had gone like, no, like, you'd have been,
that would have been fun.
Yeah, because then you'd be like, oh, actually, wow, he can't influence Han Solo. Like, he's strong-willed or he's strong-minded. Like, that would have actually been a real feather in the cap for Han Solo, and you'd have been like, oh, that character's cool. I mean, he's pretty, Harrison Ford is cool in this role, but
yeah,
it's funny.
And he would have pulled that off.
Yeah, and I think it would have made him a better character, and it would have actually made him sort of more interesting in the future films, especially his arc of accepting, the Jedi and the Force and all that sort of stuff by the later films. If actually he still couldn't be influenced by it. But yeah, you're right. Like, there's so many moments when, like you say, that could have just been simply they've just used the Force and they move on. But yeah, again, in fact, I've just thought of another one. He's able to use, he said, sort of like the Force as telekinesis, able to sort of bring the saber to him and some other bits and pieces. Yet later in the film, when they're in the Death Star, Obi-Wan has to sort of precariously walk around some part of the engine or whatever to pull a lever, and I'm thinking, couldn't you have done that from a distance and just use the Force to sort of knock it down? Because he's clearly shown he's capable. So,
oh yeah, no, and I think that happens throughout Star Wars literature and films. That, I mean, it's similar to superhero movies where it seems as if the movie forgets that they have this power, right? Like you Superman doing stuff, and you think, you don't have to hold that over, a flame, right? You have heat vision. Did the movie just forget about this? And I think that's true. I mean, I think that there's a lot of the telekinesis thing happens all the time. Yeah, I mean, we're nitpicking, but it's this kind of stuff that just makes me think, well, it's not really in control of itself. I did want to say I liked Han Solo, but I always identified with the Empire. I always just I liked Darth Vader. I thought Darth Vader was cooler than Han Solo, and I like the idea of cavorting around the galaxy and having adventures and all of that. I definitely identified with the good guys in that sense, but going back to this thing about the Academy and sort of, the Senate and how this wider world works, I never understood the rebellion. It seems like the only really horrible thing the Empire does is blow up Alderaan, which seems like one of those like gratuitous moments in a movie where they make the bad guy just kill a dog just to establish like he's really bad, and if you don't hate him, here's the scene where you're supposed to hate him. But outside of that, they don't really do anything that's bad.
No, and this is the thing I said before about, like you're saying that it comes in at episode 4 and you get the scroll and all that kind of stuff. And I've always been like, so what? And that's the question. I'm like, so why? Why is the Resistance resisting? Like, what is it? Is it, and I suppose I think you're supposed to just sort of, again, it's never really covered because then you get the prequels, which gives you a complete cockamamie story about how they take over. But just by calling it the Empire, I suppose it's supposed to be sort of, insinuated that like, okay, there's expansion, there's imperialism, it's, I wouldn't be thinking this as a kid. I'm barely thinking of it now, but it's sort of, they'd be, okay, they're going over in sort of cultural appropriation, or they're going out and just squashing all these other things and taking land and da da da. And I suppose just that idea of Empire is supposed to be considered, the evil one. All right. The Resistance is the underdog, so straight away, you have to side with them. It's almost like shorthand, isn't it? Sort of Empire equals big bad. That's it. That's all I can think of. That's it.
Well, I mean, I found myself like, there's that line in the scroll about how they're, they're trying to restore freedom. And I think, I don't hear the rebels talking a lot about voting rights. I'm not sure what freedom they're talking about. It seemed to me, I think you make a good point about sort of just Empire suggesting big bad and colonialism and exploitation. I always took it as like, I saw the sort of like Roman parallel and I thought, oh, well, there's the emperor, right? And it's not a republic, right? It's not democratic. That's all that but that's so vague, right? And they don't talk about voting rights. And of course, eventually, you do get those prequels in which the Jedi are absolutely totalitarian. I mean, it's just the people have no input on the Jedi Council, and the Jedi Council basically runs the whole show. And has massive undue influence over senators who supposedly are elected, although that's not even clear.
That's true. They're like a religious lobbying group, aren't they, in the sort of prequels, really?
Yeah, I mean, they're like the family or something in DC,
Yeah.
They're like the Mike Pence people.
Yeah, totally. Sort of like, if they were to say that, the Jedi Order doesn't support gay marriage, then that would probably be going into law. It's a weird relationship because they also say in the prequels on several occasions that they don't get involved in politics, and then they do.
They're always involved in politics.
Yeah. So again, I think this clearly comes down to Lucas having that vision but not being able to focus it. It's a vision, not a focused story.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like the rebels. I mean, I was thinking like, there are certain franchise. I love the fact that it's a saga. I love that it goes on, and I love sagas for all of their faults. But it occurred to me that like there are franchises in which the good guys are the Empire, right? And there's a rebellion, and the rebellion is the bad guys. I mean, it's one of the reasons why like GoBots always seemed a little silly, right? Because the rebels, they're like the Guardian. I know this is so dumb, but I mean, there's the Guardians, and they're the good guys, and then it's the rebels, right? The renegades.
Yes.
And the renegades are bad. It's bad to, and that always felt a little too authoritarian to me. But it's interesting, this like the way in which Star Wars kind of codifies the rebels are the good guys in this narrative, and most of the franchises that I think succeed are ones in which, if not the good guys are the rebels, the good guys certainly are the underdog, and we root for the underdog.
Well, the underdog is again, it's the easy go-to narrative, isn't it? As long as you can establish that your protagonist is the underdog, then there's a sort of just think Rocky. Like Rocky is the ultimate sort of like underdog story. So okay, he's he's a little bit, he's almost over the hill. He's been given a chance. He's way out of his league. And I always, if I think of the Rocky film, completely non-sci-fi, but the moment when he realizes in that film, he's like, I can't win. Like I cannot win this fight against Apollo Creed. All I want to do is go the distance. Like I want to be standing at the end. That to me is amazing. Like you go, okay, that's an underdog story. That's accepting your place, but really trying to aim for something. And you go along that story. And it's in this, it's just a given. They're the resistance. They're the underdog. They're a smaller force. They've got, whatever. And so, like you say, it just becomes that easy go-to. It's just cheap, quick storytelling that they're the underdog. They're the resistance. And you're supposed to side with them. That and it's almost a given, isn't it? You're supposed to. They don't give them any justification for being that.
Yeah. I mean, Rogue One has that. Rogue One starts with, a family being, executed, or a wife being executed and the kid running away. And you see just kind of like, oh, yeah, this is the Empire is doing stuff like this. And in the original Star Wars, nobody says anything about like, yeah, the Empire, decimated my people. It'd be so easy to have somebody like somebody say that in those scenes. Nobody says anything like that. They're just like, let's kill these guys. And this is part of why I identified with the Empire, even as a kid. I thought, these rebels just want to blow stuff up. The Empire has made a base the size of a moon. I mean, granted, there are a couple guys who are mid-level management who are using that to blow up a planet. That ain't cool. But this Empire has clearly got its act together. Technology is progressing under them. I don't see the rebels inventing an atomic bomb. I don't see them building, space stations like this. They just want to blow stuff up. And I don't know why.
Weirdly. Well, yeah, you're never really given justification, and again, it comes to shorthand. They're like, because the sole purpose of the Death Star. I mean, they call it the Death Star. Like, it's not. They're not hiding. They're not hiding in any way. So they're like, yeah, cool name. So it's cheap, easy storytelling. It's like, right, it's the Death Star. It's basically a floating moon-sized cannon in space. Like it's there to destroy a planet. That's its sole purpose. And so you do go, okay, well, that's pretty evil. That's pretty bad. And funnily enough, in recent years, there was a comedy show over here. They did several things, but they did a sketch where it's the two of them dressed as Nazis, and at one point they're like, are we the bad guys? And they're going like, no, we can't be the bad guys. Of course we're not the bad guys. We're winning. And yeah, but our uniform has skulls on it. And we're called a death squad. And it's sort of like, it's just that realization. Like at some point, someone's be going like, Death Star's not a great name. Like you're trying to instill fear. Fair enough, but so it's not winning hearts and minds, is it? Like they are going for that totalitarian vibe, but it feels cheap. Like you're not being given justification. You're just being told, Death Star are bad. Empire, okay, well they're the bad guys. Darth Vader's dressed all in black and will kill his own people. Okay, well he's bad. It's sort of
yeah. I mean, it's funny. Some of them backtalk to Vader to a shocking degree that isn't consistent with the other movies. There are a few scenes where, they're dismissing the concept of the Force. It's like, yeah, you all remember these Clone Wars you keep talking about. This doesn't make sense. But, you think one of those guys would say, look, Lord Vader, we need to talk about branding. I'm thinking the space
Yeah.
defense cannon.
Yeah, yeah, it would be, wouldn't it? That's the sort of thing. The two things there is really one thing that's always bothered me is continuity, and being a comic. Both you and I sort of being comic coming from history. Continuity means a lot. So in this, when they do refer to the Jedi as an ancient religion and sort of like your old religion and your old ways, and you go, wow, how old is this? Oh, the last Jedi was killed about 15 years ago. It's not that old, really, is it? Let's be honest. It feels again that when the history probably hasn't been thought out. He was thinking maybe forwards, but not back.
Right.
But yeah, from a branding point of view, it's that again, I find that this goes to the design that when you meet the Imperial soldiers, I mean the stormtroopers, again called stormtroopers, it's not it's not a big leap to go from there to Nazi. But then all the uniforms are very simple lines. It's that very sort of excuse me, very simple lines. They're grey. They've got that sort of insignia. Like they're trying to tell you quite quickly that these are the bad guys. But what I also take is, I'll edit this cough out.
Good idea.
Is that yeah. The story comes down to, in some cases, science versus magic.
Yes.
You've said that the Empire's invented a literal space station that is a giant cannon. They've got massive space, star cruisers, these huge spaceships, which are a massive technological advancement. They're incredible. And then you see this Jedi, and he's like, "Oh, we have a lightsaber. It's the weapon of a sort of more civil age and all this other stuff." And you're like, "It's a sword." And some magic tricks. Like it's that thing, isn't it? It's magic versus science. And it starts to. It's that thing of like, well, you're right. You've tried to portray that the Empire is bad. But I can almost imagine that sort of, again, the scene from the Monty Python. You say the Roman thing. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, irrigation, wine, education, all sort of stuff.
Roads.
What has the Empire given us? Yeah. So yeah, what's the Empire given us? Or interstellar travel? Oh yeah, okay. What else? Well, apart from interstellar travel, what else have they given us? Oh well, trade routes and a wider economic base. Oh yeah, okay.
Right.
It feels like you could easily implement that and have that conversation where they're like, yeah, they are evil, but they have done some really good things.
Right. I mean,
ways and means.
All these planets. I mean, Star Wars often, not so much in this film, but often kind of falls into the silliness of like, this is the gaming planet, this is the forest planet, this is the and none of those economies are going to survive without trade. I mean, I could well imagine those conversations being like, well, you realize that if the Empire fell, this entire planet would starve overnight. We specialize in X and we trade it for Y, and that's efficient. That's a good thing. So that was another reason why I sort of, I mean, I got the Empire was bad, but I sort of feel like, I want to be the guy who just says, all right, Lord Vader, look, I know you've got this fear thing going and you believe that fear is a great motivator, but you also know you can only push people so far. I'm glad you built your big space cannon. Let's just temper this with making sure that people are fed. And, the rebellion is a problem. We want them to fear us. That's great. That's fine. And that's just. But it's just because we're also making sure people are fed, and life isn't quite so hard on some of these, stupid colony planets, And
well, I think,
yeah,
well, I think Force Awakens actually highlights the fact that they failed. Clearly, for this very reason, that they beat the Empire, right? They at least they bring down the Emperor, and these sorts of whatever the associates with it, but they don't implement anything to replace it. So the First Order is simply filling it seems to me grows out of, I mean, it's 30 years, but it seems to grow out of a void of leadership.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
So, you got the rebellion.
But I mean,
so actually, it's the rebellion, isn't it? But like the rebellion against the Empire, but the resistance in the Force Awakens, it's the resistance now. The resistance that is now is against the First Order. It's like, yeah, but you had your chance. You beat the Emperor and the second Death Star, and you had all your fun with the Ewoks and all that kind of jazz. You clearly didn't then build up a suitable government basis to bring all these planets back together, and somebody else did.
Well, I mean, The Force Awakens, there's a lot that I like about it, but I'm fond of saying it's a film that can be destroyed in one sentence. And that sentence is, why is there a rebellion? Why is there a resistance still? Who are you resisting? The First Order isn't running the show. I mean, the First Order is more like a terrorist organization or something. The entire point after Return of the Jedi is, okay, you won, you're in charge now. And, I mean, I'm always interested in it's part of why I hate the ending of A New Hope. I'm always interested in the denouement. I'm always interested in, you defeated the alien hordes, right? But now the Earth is kind of a wasteland, and it's littered with alien technology. And a lot, religion's going to change, government's going to change, technology's going to change. The world is is unrecognizable 20 years out. That is a more interesting story to me than yet another, defeating the alien story. A more interesting story to me than the original trilogy of Star Wars is the weird bureaucratic trilogy that should have followed of, Luke saying, oh God, I used to be a Jedi, and, remember when we were gallivanting around the galaxy with Han, and now I'm managing the books. And now I'm, sitting here acting as a diplomat, negotiating a trade dispute between these two planets I've never been to. But they're only going to listen to the great Luke. Only my voice is going to keep them from going to war. And this is what I do now. And it's all I've done for 20 years.
Yeah. That would have been, or a better story. That's it. Like, there's a better story than what we get. I mean, he goes off and he leaves them. According to this, he goes off and leaves them to it. He's like, "Well, we've caused this mess. You go fix it. We've caused this massive disruption to this intergalactic economy. Go fix it."
Right? They're barbarians. They're the barbarians at the gate who aren't interested in replacing Rome. I mean, in reality, the barbarians that sacked Rome, when Rome actually falls, they say, "Oh, I'm the new Roman emperor." This is not the way the world works. But if they are the barbarians, I mean, and we're talking about A New Hope, but the point about A Force Awakens is, the franchise is so wedded to that concept of we're the resistance, right? We're the underdogs. That even when there's nothing to be an underdog to, they have to just skip time and not really show you the massive failure, of what the rebellion did. The rebellion is evil. The rebellion overthrew the empire and left nothing left. I mean, this would be like a terrorist organization that its goal was to take out, let's say, London or Washington, D.C. And you said, okay, well, what kind of society do you envision? Is it a nightmare, genderscape like Handmaid's Tale, or is it a utopia? And they say, oh, no, we don't envision anything. We just want to take out Washington, D.C. or London. And you say, really now? You're worse than the Handmaid's Tale people. Yeah. At least they have a vision.
Yeah, and that's it. I think you're right. I think there's this idea of leadership, and I think this comes down to Hollywood as well. It comes back to other franchises I've covered that really seem to struggle with these things, becoming wedded to an idea or a character. But I almost wanted to see this idea of like there's a notion in the original trilogy that Luke could give in to the dark side, and he and he actually sort of there's several moments of give in to that anger. As the Emperor says to him in sort of Return of the Jedi, yeah, he's like, good, give in. Maybe I almost want to see that sort of the Michael Corleone moment that comes years on.
Yes.
That actually he's got power, and power does corrupt.
Yes.
And you see that moment when Leia's like, Luke, what have you done? What have you're starting to become? And eventually you see him making those deals with the Ukraine behind closed doors. And that's what I want to see. That moment with the doors closing and Luke crossing the line to actually becoming the new, not even the new Darth Vader, but the new Emperor, like fully corrupted. That would actually be the saga. Like, that's where the Godfather trilogy works sometimes better as a saga because it's so tragic. They are willing to sacrifice both people and sort of the family. But with Star Wars, like you say, it's called A New Hope, and it's supposed to be a brighter future. But they just can't. They're wedded to that, aren't they? This idea of it being the resistance and the underdog, and it's like, well, maybe that's not what you need anymore. When they bring this saga to the end with the Rise of Skywalker, I'm fascinated to see what they're going to do next.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think you are entirely right, and I think in those years between the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, as I thought about, you would talk with your friends about sort of like, well, what was going to happen next? These were episodes 4, 5, and 6, right? What were 7, 8, and 9 going to be? In those endless discussions that I had, the idea that Luke would assume this powerful role and inevitably be corrupted by power, that was absolutely what I was sold on. And I think you articulated perfectly. That should have been what happened. But, it's a lot harder to sell that as a story. It's a lot harder to sell, trade disputes and, they try to do it in the prequels a little, but it's a lot harder to sell, big budget sequels about those kinds of things than it is, what we've gotten with the sequel trilogy, which has some poetry to it, but in which the A Force Awakens is basically structurally it really is A New Hope redux, right?
Mm-hmm.
And The Last Jedi is structurally I've looked at garbage fires that had more structure than The Last Jedi, but as much as I'm a Star Wars detractor, I'm gonna go see Episode 9, right? And I love sagas, right? And I love to nitpick them, and I love to have these conversations where we say, well, it should have really done this, and it didn't have the courage or the smarts or whatever. But, I'm a sucker for the continuing narrative and the franchise.
No, I think we've reached a point, but let's just give a snippet then for final thoughts. So let's give some final thoughts to round out sort of Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. What's your final thoughts on this then, Julian?
I think it's a great movie for its visuals. I think it's a great movie for its design sense, its music, and its inspiring ideas. I don't know that it's a great movie, and I think that its influence is outsized, and we do well to diminish it. What about you, Scott? Sorry.
No, I think you're right. I think just your first sentence. It's a great movie, and I think is the fact it's a great kids movie. For me, it's candy floss coated with some sort of faux philosophy. I came into it as a kid. I saw it as a kid, and I love it. And I think as I said before, it's difficult to disconnect that nostalgia. If I'd watched this for the first time as an adult, I think I would struggle with it more. I think this is a really entertaining easy to digest kids film. And I think that's the best way I can describe it. And it does sort of fall to pieces when you really press on it. But the fact is, there's a lot of films I really enjoy. As I said, sort of Goonies. Not so much about Back to the Future, but I'll put it this way: I really like Monster Squad, and that film does not stand up. So it falls in that category. I think it's a good, fun kids movie, and I think if people enjoy it, brilliant. Just like you say, don't try and quote it as a life-changing experience. I think at times.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that's very fair. And also, I just want to say, because we live in this culture in which, we're going to get angry tweets about this episode, Scott.
Oh yeah. I'm prepared. I understand that now. Yeah.
But I mean, I just want to say, I'm a fan of people having fun. I love that you like Monster Squad. I love that you like Goonies. I mean, I have Star Wars in my DNA. I like Transformers movies. I mean, I know they're stupid. That's okay.
Yes.
We can like stuff and don't have to defend it as the pinnacle of all art that is flawless and a masterpiece. And it's okay to say it's got good ideas and it's good for what it is. I just think we need some sort of ability to do that culturally.
Oh yeah, I agree. And like I said, I having watched this, having watched New Hope, I will go on and watch the others just to sort of work my way through it, ready for Rise of Skywalker. Like most definitely, and I do enjoy it. Like I do get that, like get wrapped up in that nostalgia, and it's wonderful. But like you say, we need to be able to sort of criticize these films. We need to be able to look at them and say, do you know what? Some of it is a bit wonky, or it hasn't stood up. But do you know what? If you love it, like you say, all power to you. That's fantastic. I have people that sort of, I know this whole Marvel DC thing as well, where they defend sort of like, the Marvel universe versus like Batman v Superman. I'm like, if you love it, love it. I've got no problem either way. Like, like you say, I love films that I know are terrible. But you've got to be able to have those discussions, and you've got to be at least honest to say, do you know what? Some of this doesn't stand up. It's only fair.
Yeah, and if you love it, you win, because you get a movie that you love and you get to enjoy it. I mean, I kind of love Rogue One. I mean, there's stuff I love about Star Wars, but if you love it, you win. You get to a movie in a franchise that you love, and how awesome is that?
Yeah, that's it. So if you love it, love it. I think there's going to be a few others. We'll come across others like this, I think, on this franchise where, we'll hold up some of those sort of those sort of sacred cows, and see how they actually fare, down the line.
So, speaking of which, what's our next episode?
Next episode, we're jumping forward a couple of years to another, I would say, sacred cow. We're leaving the 90s. At the 90s, we're leaving the 70s, and we're going into the early 80s. And our next film, I'm just going to double check, is Blade Runner.
Yes.
So we're going to I was going to say to a not too distant future. We've actually
right. We've passed it, right?
Yeah, we've passed it. And much like 2015 didn't give me a hoverboard. I don't have any replicants either. So,
well, boy, Blade Runner, that yawn fest. It's such a terrible influence. I'm just joking.
We'll have to see how that one fares. But again, we've got Harrison Ford, a very different Harrison Ford, I think. And so next up is Blade Runner. But I will be fair, if you want to get in contact with us and you want to let us know your thoughts and feelings about Star Wars and our opinions on Star Wars, or any of the films we did, Forbidden Planet, we did Solaris, you can contact us on Twitter, and that's at PodTimeSpace. That's PodTimespace. Pod Time Space. So please find us on Twitter and let us know. I'm sure we'd like to say we're going to get some angry tweets from George Lucas. But Julian, it's been a fantastic conversation, and
I loved it, Scott.
It's been a doozy. So yeah, let's see how we fare with Blade Runner next time. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.